we were talking the other day about, you probably remember this, when we would have war rooms, right? And
Yeah.
you would all be ready to go. This person, that person. And it's not like that anymore. I mean, you have to be ready to go at any particular moment. But the thing that we always stress in those kinds of situations, if you're going to be successful at that collective group, I'm going to say of marketing folks and other folks, need to come together on a regular basis and sort of be ready and prepared to jump into action, basically.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of WFA's Better Marketing, supported by Meta. Thanks to them for doing that. And I'm delighted to welcome Judy Smith today. Judy has an absolute storied career, over 25 years of experience counseling presidents and world leaders through crises and complex situations and helping them navigate that most difficult of things, how to keep their reputation intact when the shit is really hitting the fan. She was the first ever Black woman to enter the White House communications team as the Deputy Communications Secretary to President George W. Bush. And I think you're the first person I've ever had on here, Judy, that's had such a great career that they even made a TV series
Yes.
Featuring you. Scandal. And Judy is an absolute expert in corporate affairs at every level. But let's get right at it, Judy. So first up, how are you? How are you doing?
I am doing great. I have no complaints.
As you sit in Washington, D.C., there are many tangents available to us, but we'll maybe come back to that right at the end.
Yeah.
But, when you look across your career and counseling many an organization, a president along the way or two, are there themes that repeat themselves? Are there issues that you think, oh, here we go again, this is the truth of what we're looking at here?
Yeah. I think for me, when I'm always, dealing with those, I would say any official and any person basically is, and in particular, I think on that, high level suite that you're talking about, I think a rule that I go by is you always want to be who you say you are. And that is important. It doesn't matter to me if you're talking to, do you know what I mean, a CEO or something really difficult that you have to get across, but I think that's important. And I feel very lucky because we have worked with a good, I think, variety and cross section of different clients from a whole lot of sectors, associations, non-government, et cetera, et cetera. And it's given us, I think, an opportunity to really successfully navigate those issues. The ones where I think it's important, where, values are key and you really got to focus on that North Star to get that central key narrative right. Yeah.
And, this is, I think Jeff Bezos's definition of a brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room.
Yeah.
And I think that, I think that's relevant, particularly at the moment. I mean, we had a discussion not long ago with the fabulous Antonio Lucio.
Oh,
And
wow.
one of the things he was talking about was, to manage your brand's reputation today, you've also got to manage the AI version of that. In other words,
Yes.
what's being said by the large language models. Have you encountered that? And, because I love your be who you say you are, the certainty of that will land every time, but how to get the algorithm to get that too?
Yeah. I mean, as the technology progresses, I mean, there's certainly, clients that we work with that are concerned about it, basically. But to your point, and we were talking about this earlier, technology is going to move ahead, whether we like it or not. I think what we have to figure out, I think collectively, are what are the kinds of guardrails, right, that might be helpful as we continue to move, down the road with AI, basically.
And are you seeing any particular threats with AI in this reputation space?
I think threats in the sense of people sometimes getting it wrong, but I have to say, even before AI, we've had that anyway, essentially. So I don't think that's any different. I think the biggest threat, honestly, that when you hear people talk about it, just at cocktail parties, whatever, it's more about jobs, right? What is it going to do to somebody's livelihood, quite frankly, right? Do they not need me? Do our companies are cutting? What does that all mean? And I think folks are just still trying to figure all that out.
Yeah, I mean, I heard somebody defending the notion the other day and said, "Do you remember blacksmiths?" To which I went vaguely and said, "Well, there aren't any more of them now, are there?" And
Right.
everybody finds jobs, which is a very glib answer. I mean, I think this is a big issue that will come back, and you can see that in the risk barometer, more of which in a minute. But before we get into that, I did want to talk a little bit about the complexity for a chief marketing officer, a chief communications officer today, where they're trying to drive performance ahead, they're trying to drive growth, but they've got to look at what they're doing through a series of lenses. How is my reputation doing? What's the culture internally? How's our trust externally? What are the competitors up to? What's innovation doing?
Yeah.
And with risk growing everywhere,
Yes.
how are you seeing that? How are you counseling people to keep focused and, I guess, not get overstressed?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a good question. I think, to your point, we're in a situation where many more marketing officers and quite frankly, communications leaders are feeling that pressure in terms of performance, but also in terms of customer interaction. Things are just moving very, very quickly, basically. And so I think what that problem presents internally for all of what we do is, making sure that as an organization, in particular on the marketing side, that there are no silos. Do you know what I mean? That people are working together as groups, basically. We were talking the other day about, you probably remember this, when we would have war rooms, right? And
Yeah.
you would all be ready to go, this person, that person. And it's not like that anymore. I mean, you have to be ready to go at any particular moment. But the thing that we always stress in those kinds of situations, if you're going to be successful at that collective group, I'm going to say, of marketing folks and other folks, need to come together on a regular basis and sort of be ready and prepared to jump into action, basically. Does that make sense on your end?
Oh,
Yeah.
100%, 100%. And I guess this notion as well of the collective needs to be who they say they are. So, when you're talking about a brand has to show up with the authenticity of what it stands for, and go through thick and thin. And once upon a time, in your world, you would have been given people, crisis management playbooks and things to do. And I think that era seems to me to be past because life moves too fast now. But
Oh, 100%. And to your point, I think it's so much more scrutiny now, right? And so you can have a playbook all nicely ready, mapped out, that sort of thing, but you still don't really have a good idea of how whatever you are putting out there, people are going to react to. And so you have to be ready, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. People, I were talking about this the last time we got together. Think about marketing campaigns that people are developing, right? And if you get that culture in wrong on a marketing campaign, there goes the marketing campaign, but it tremendously impacts the brand and reputation that you were trying to build up.
yeah, and I think we've seen many an example of that, and obviously a lot of that happened in the pandemic. But the world we're in today, I think we're going to see more, which segues neatly into. Just want to touch a little bit on the risk barometer, and in your role as chair at the Intangibles, we're the WFO really grateful for your support in funding the risk barometer. And actually, a sneak preview, whilst we'll be releasing the full results in the Global Marketer Week in Stockholm, we can touch on a couple of things here. I mean, I'm not particularly surprised that marketers around the world see the environment as tougher than it was this time last year. 8 out of 10 express this through the lens of, are your budgets, under scrutiny? Is what you're up to under scrutiny?
Mhm.
8 out of 10 were worried about it. That's now 9 out of 10.
Yeah.
And actually, the whole notion of the environment for brands being seen as risky, that's up from 81% last year to well over 90. And, in these circumstances, I think the jobs are getting tougher. I mean, how do you see the risk barometer helping inform people's actions?
I think, to your point, given the culture and space that we're in, I think the risk barometer is extremely helpful. It gives you a sense of where things are going to land on the risk barometer, but it also, I think, allows you ahead of time to try to get prepared. And it also allows you to, I would say, be able to change, alter, right? What you're doing based on the risk barometer. So I think it will be helpful.
And the flip of that is often, in that simplistic way of seeing things, what gets measured gets done. And some of the things are measurable and others aren't. I think the whole intangible space is a brilliant one because, when you're a brand focused person, as I am, you know how valuable the intangibles are, but you know how difficult it is to actually put a value on them. And are you seeing measurement shift? Are you seeing people wanting to know the value of their intangibles, their brand, their reputation?
I do, because it's more, it becomes more and more important, I think, for several reasons. One, as the brand grows, right, you want to be able to track that. But I also think that culture has shifted, and so have companies. These intangible things that sometimes are difficult to measure, but we figured out a way to do that. But those kinds of things that before that folks were not used to grabbing a hold of, right? And I think the risk barometer is also extremely helpful because the landscape that we're living in is changing. It's like very rapid, and you need to be constantly, I think, assessing where your reputation is, what kind of decisions you're making, how you're communicating, and things are moving at a quicker speed, I think.
So, Judy, here's a tough question. The intangibles, it's in the name, really, isn't it? But how do you make the intangibles financially tangible? What would your advice be?
One of the things, to your point about the risk barometer, and thank you for the partnership that you guys have helped with us. We appreciate. But I think those intangible assets, they have to be treated almost like, we were talking about this the other day, like two sides of a coin, right? One side of it is the protection part, right? That's important, and managing the crisis, right? But there's also another side of it that you have to look at, which is, long-term value, basically. And so I want to make sure that companies understand that the challenge in this situation, and companies, you can still handle these things, right? But you and I touched on it a little bit, but it can't be in silos. It doesn't work that way anymore. You remember how usually if there was a crisis or an issue, you would go to this one person who was assigned it?
Yeah.
I think the best outcomes that we've seen is when all the people at the table, right? Whether it's legal, policy, communications, because then you're protecting the overall value of your asset in a very, I think, cohesive way, basically.
And I think the role of leadership here is interesting. I wanted to ask you, because I know you'll have helped many a leader along the way. And when leaders step into a company that's had a crisis, and they're trying to turn things around, and that's often the gap between what a brand has promised and what they deliver. is actually got too wide. What are you looking for when a leader sets about fixing things in the first 90 days, 100 days, depending on which business book you believe? How do leaders get focused?
Yeah, I think one of the way that leaders get focused at the outset is have a clear vision of what they want to try to accomplish. And to your point, we see more and more CEOs now coming into companies where they might just sort of wait and, take a look, see and see how things going, but coming in with a very, um, I would say, clear vision of how they want to operate and making changes very, very quickly because the landscape is moving too quick.
Yeah, and I think that I'll avoid using bad language now, but
Okay.
when you're looking when you're looking at new leaders, many focus on setting about communication and being open and being direct. But how do you spot whether what they're doing is polishing the story rather than delivering change?
Yeah. Look, I think there is room and a time and a place for polishing stories, right? And I don't think it's bad that that CEOs and those folks are trying to do it. But to your point, I think if you want to make real change, right, you want to send a very clear signal, I think, as CEO to say that, right? And say, look, this is the kind of change that I think is needed at this juncture. This is what we're going to do. I think what's important in those situations, though, is making sure that you are building brand loyalty, but not losing it, right? And being able to cultivate those relationships with you and move them along with you as well.
And I guess that you've got plenty of experience in the turnaround space, and if I were asking you, what is it that signifies a turnaround is working? Where do you start? I mean, what are you looking for as the early signals of this is going to work?
I think the early signals of this is going to work is making sure that everybody, you see that everybody is getting behind it, right? That I think everybody has a clear understanding of what the turnaround is about, what you're trying to accomplish. The roles have been identified, but also to the risk have been identified because we know that there's nothing that any organization really does without risk, potential risk, given the cultural landscape that we're in. And I think, generally speaking, that turnarounds start, I would say, from the inside out, right? And there's a lot that boils down to, like I was saying, with leadership, basically. But I also think the good thing about turnarounds is that it gives an opportunity for a lot of, I think, honest dialogue, which I think is great.
We have a very good podcast over here by a couple of PR folk, which is called "When the Hits the Fan."
Oh, I love that! What a
Yeah,
great title! I love it.
yeah. And I'm an avid listener, but it's interesting because obviously there's an awful lot to learn from failure.
Yes, yeah.
People don't often like to talk about failure, but most people very happy to talk about success. So I'd love to ask you when you've been advising people and it's failed, but I'm not going to do that. Let's talk about
You can if you want.
leaders that you've seen successfully navigate uncertainty and turn things around. I mean, if you could talk about who they were or what the characteristics they share are, that would be really helpful.
Okay.
Because this navigating through uncertainty is, that's where we are right now.
Yeah. I think for me, one of the things I have seen, it's actually a phrase that I use a lot, which is that be who you say you are, right? And I think the best leaders that I've seen are exactly that, right? They have a very strong, I think, sense of their personal and their organizational values and ethics. And they behave in, I think, a very consistent, even manner, even when times are tough and difficult. And I think the thing that also helps is having clearly a lot of clarity on your values, right? Because when there are issues around certain things, you need to be clear as a leader about where you stand on those issues.
So to get back to where we started, I mean, right now we are in some of the riskiest environments I think I've ever seen in my career.
Yeah.
And as you sit in Washington, how is that for business? I mean, what are people talking to you about? How do they deal with tariffs up one day, tariffs down another, etc.?
Yeah, I mean it is difficult. I tell you two things. One thing that we did ahead of time was a lot of companies and organizations came prior to the new administration coming in, right? And saying, okay, what do we need to do a little differently? What do we need to change? What do we need to alter? What can we improve on? All of those kinds of things. And so by the time that the administration got going, those folks were prepared, right? And I think that's a plus. I think now what we're seeing is, as you know, I mean, I just looked at the news this morning. Things go so quickly, basically. And I think and this is probably not a bad trait for, I think, leaders to have, is, it requires that people stay so on top of these issues now because they're moving fast, but being prepared to respond if you have to, but also know when not to respond, basically. Because sometimes organizations are eager to get their point of view out on a proactive basis when it's not necessary. It's not going to enhance their value.
Yeah, because the difference between what you might communicate internally and what you need to communicate externally is nuanced at times like this. And
Yes.
I think we talked about it when we first met. What happened in Black Lives Matter.
Yep.
Many companies will look back at and go, "What were we thinking?"
Mm-hmm.
Actually,
No, that's true. And you hear some organizations doing that now, right? To your point, like, why were we there? What happened? Looking at it in a retroactive point of view, which is good because I think you can always learn. There's always lessons to be learned from the actions that one's take, good and bad.
and this whole notion of staying calm in a storm and not responding emotionally. I mean, I guess you're partly coaching people as well as giving them expertise advice.
Yeah, 100%. And sometimes it's hard. But what we do know is with culture, things just move so quickly, right? It could be at 10 o'clock, a company is called and, upset because I don't know, there's a bad article or there's uh, something online that says that there's going to be a major protest or something. Right now, I think before companies would immediately respond, right? But I think now, because there's so much noise and so much chatter, that people are taking let's breathe, let's take a breath, let's wait and see first before we jump out there and jump in there with whatever our messaging is. Because once you step into the conversation, as you know, you yourself, the organization, can become a target, basically. Yeah.
Judy, can we just talk about this in the context of fake news? I think that phrase first came out of he who is the president these days mouth, and it's become a thing. And actually, you can see the danger of that. I was watching an astonishing documentary called The Manosphere the other night, about influencers and some of the stuff they do, and some of the things they say that are just plain wrong. But how do you counter that? So in in our digital environment, what do you think about fake news and what to do? And from a company perspective, is ignoring it the way, or what's your advice?
Yeah, my advice is I would depend on what the fake news is, right? To me, if the test I use, if somebody is out there saying something that's wrong or fake, right? Does it actually impact the company's brand or reputation, right? Otherwise than that, what you're going to find yourself is getting into a what we want to call slugfest. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
Unnecessarily, basically,
Yeah.
right? And so I think a little bit of pause on it would be helpful.
And my the older I get, the more one of my favorite answers to a question is, I don't know.
But that's okay. That's all
Yeah.
right. That's
Yeah,
all
no, 'cause
right.
well, sometimes I mean, I think so, reflection is necessary. You have to think things through, and I think getting the answer right in timely fashion is better than saying something fast and incorrectly. And Judy, just to go slightly off script here, I mentioned you're our first ever guest that's had a TV series based on you. Can you talk about that a little bit? I mean, it must have been, what's the word? Weird?
Yeah, yeah. No, that's the correct word. Yes. Well, let me say I didn't have a planned strategy for that, basically. I was thinking about writing a book. And so the book seemed to turn into a TV show, and there we go, right?
Yeah.
I remember, though, the person that I was most concerned about in regarding Scandal, because people who watched it knows that there was a relationship that my character, not me, a relationship that my character was having with the president. And so one of the jobs that I remember that I had to do was to pick up the phone and call the president about the show, because he's such a jokester, and teases about things. And so I called him on the phone and I left a message to say, give me a call. It's, really important. I need to talk to you about something, et cetera, et cetera. And so he called me back. I was on a conference call, though, with like 20 people, so I couldn't get it. And he left a message and said something like, "Oh my God, this is the best thing ever that's happened to me. We're having an affair. This is great. I'm going to send out a post." So I had to immediately call him and say, "Do not send anything out. Don't joke about this." He said, "No," he said, "I'm not president anymore. This could be good for my brand and my reputation." And, he said all the young kids and the work in the office was telling him that. I'm like, "Look, if you don't make any jokes about this. If you do, I'm going to tell your boss." And he said, "You wouldn't?" I said, "I would. I'm going to call Barbara and let her know. So don't joke about this," basically. But look, he was so incredibly wonderful to me and very gracious. He must have given me 5 or 6, parties or events, right, just to support me. And he was very supportive and encouraging about it. So it was a nice thing. It's
That's
one of
great.
those things in life you would never imagine or ever plan, basically. You just have to decide if you're going to want to do it or not. Yeah, pretty
All
much.
right, Judy. Well, listen, what a delight to spend time with you. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
taking the time to talk to us. And I know there'll be some really valuable lessons for people here. And I'm really looking forward to seeing you again soon. And we should dive into, what is the risk barometer telling us in this environment, which is, let's face it, the most difficult one. It's the most difficult one I've certainly ever faced. And I'm sure there are others who will say there are other times that have been more difficult. But anyway, as
Yeah.
I said, thank you so much. Absolute delight.
Oh, thanks
Um,
for having me. I appreciate it.
all right, Judy, thanks so much. See you
Okay.
very soon.
All
Take
right.
care.
Bye bye.